Hi, everybody. My name is Alex Pletzer, and I'm really privileged to present or chair this session about high performance computing and code optimization. As our first speaker, we're going to have Manodeep Sinha from Swinburne University of Technology, just across the ditch. So he's going to talk about correlation functions and how to compute the correlation coefficients, I guess, as fast as we can on CPUs. Over to you, Manodeep.
Thanks, Alexander. Good to be here. Thank you all for accepting my talk. So I'm an astronomer. I work at the Swinburne University of Technology. Looks like my slides aren't showing up. Let me reshare. Okay. Share. All right, this should be better. Can you guys see my slides? Yes, perfect. All right, so start again. So I am an astronomer. My name is Manodeep Sinha. I work at the Swinburne University of Technology across the pond in Australia. And today I'm going to talk to you about a code I wrote. It's an open source code called Corrfunc. It computes correlation functions. As an astronomer, I work with galaxies and things on the universe scale. And so correlation functions are a way of quantifying what these galaxies look like statistically, right? So Corrfunc is an open source package. It has a logo, so you know it's legit, right? And here's the repo is public. Anyone can use it, download it. My primary collaborator on the Corrfunc project, Lehman Garrison, who's at the Flatiron Institute in New York. And of course, we have been very lucky to receive contributions from multiple collaborators over the years. So before we start about correlation functions, sort of set you up for what astronomers are talking about. Let's look at something more familiar. This is what the world looks like at night. Okay, like this is what the light distribution looks like. You can sort of make out that there's a lot of light on the US eastern coast. I come from India. That's not really that well lit up, which is probably a good thing as an astronomer. And you can sort of see that the light is kind of patchy. It's very concentrated, but then somewhat patchy. And as humans, we understand that this is how it is because people generate this light. This is human light, right? The light used by humans. And humans live within land. And so sort of by construction, the light is always confined within where land is, right? So it's not surprising that there are these vast empty spots. Galaxies are similar. Galaxies are made of stars. The stars are the source of light. But galaxies live in this thing called dark matter halos, which don't have any light. And so what we're seeing in this analogy is we are trying to take what we see, which is the light, and then figure out what we don't see, which is the land. And this is the sort of a very fundamental question within astronomy is how does the light, galaxies, live within halos? So we try to understand that. And correlation functions are useful to do that. So we have had galaxy surveys for a long time now, 20 years plus. This is the Sloan Digital Sky Survey. It's an international collaboration. And they saw something like that. This is each dot that you may or may not be able to see in this is a galaxy, right? And that galaxy extends far back into time, and you can sort of see empty spots in the galaxy distribution on the sky. And it is a lot of data. As they jokingly said back in 2014, they had 500,000 HTTP worth of data back in 2014, right? So they generate a lot of data as well. But that's what galaxy surveys see. They see galaxies. They see the light from galaxies. But from the simulations, from the theory side, we can't actually simulate galaxies as easily. What we can simulate are these dark matter halo distributions. And that looks like this. This figure is from one of the simulations I ran. And it looks very filamentary and voids. And this is also sort of a traditional shred from where I come from that looks like the filamentary structure of halos and galaxies, right? So we can easily simulate this, but what we can see is something different. This is the sort of cities, the light, that is what we can see. And so the question is, how do we reliably map between the two? How do we take our galaxies and then infer what the dark matter is? So take our city lights and say where the land is. And how do we, given the land, how do we come up with a prescription that sort of gives us the light, which is, so maybe you use the rivers, you use the soil fertility and so on. So this is where correlation functions come in. So all it is doing is it's a statistical measure, and it's saying on the x-axis is some angular separation, in this case, some separation. Here it's an angular separation. This is from 1977. I suspect some of the people in the audience were not born. It is that old of a tool, of a technique. And what you have on the x-axis is some angular separation, and starting at some small scale, some minimum separation, and going all the way out to like 10 degrees on the sky, right? Something, maybe that. And on the y-axis is a measure of the excess probability. Like, if you just took 10 points and distributed in the sky, there is some random probability that 2 points would appear at a certain separation. So this measures the excess. The y-axis measures the excess probability. So higher the y-axis is, the more non-random it is. And we know galaxies are not randomly distributed, right? 0 would be consistent with the random. So 0 is not on this scale because it's also a log scale. But 0 is a random distribution. And as you go higher up, it's a more clustered distribution. It's more unlikely that thing is occurred by chance. And what this boils down to, right? It boils down to measuring pairwise separation. So you have 1 point here and 1 point there, and you measure the separation between those 2 points, and then make a histogram out of it. Like, you have bins and you add the pairs into the correct bins. That's all it is. But it's a very powerful tool that lets us go between what's simulated easily to what's observed, and what's observed to what's simulated, right? And this might seem like an overreaching statement, but it is fundamental. Like, correlation functions are fundamental to understanding how galaxies populate halos. As I showed, the code can be quite straightforward. Let's say you have one set of particles with n1 points and one with n2. All you have to do is write a double for loop, and then given 2 points, you need to know how do you measure the separation. So the distance metric, it could be angular, it could be Cartesian, or it could be Manhattan block, whatever. And then once you have that, you need to find out which histogram bin you want to increment, and that's it. You count one pair. But if you do that, it's going to be really slow, because nowadays we run into galaxies with tens of millions and hundreds of millions of galaxies, surveys with that many. So to design software that runs fast, to do that, you have to do custom software. And today's HPC is basically, the compute is free. All of these mathematical operations are free. However, moving data from RAM to the CPU is what is expensive. There is fundamental constraints from how CPUs are designed. Is if you access memory in a contiguous manner, it's going to be faster. If you operate on many things, single instruction, multiple data, so vectorized, that's faster. So this gives us two complementary operations. One is reduce the total number of computations, so reduce the data movement. And the other one is perform these calculations really fast. So here I'm primarily talking about vectorized. Corrfunc, as a title may have sort of screamed, is blazing fast. And it is fast because we have, over a while now, we have used multiple things. So we take particles and then grid it up into some spatial cells. We store particles continuously. We use sorting where we can. We use vectorized code, manual vectorized code, and we use OpenMP. So all the things that make Corrfunc really fast. Let me sort of take you through. So let's say the red, this is your spatial domain, the black outer square, and the reds are your points in the square. So if you want to compute a correlation function out to R max, then you can sort of approximate it by partitioning the space into cells of side R max. So then for any given blue point that falls in that center cell, only the shaded cells need to be checked for potential pairs. What that means is you have now converted pi r squared into 9 times r squared. Right? It's not too terrible. And then if you do that, you can actually make it better. You can refine it. So now it's 2 pairs with R max. And if I change it, if I subdivide it, then you can see that the rightmost shaded region does not need to be checked against the leftmost shaded region, right? And you can simply keep going like that. You can sub-refine, and you can make it even less so. So given a target cell and a query cell, you can just check whether the minimum separation between the is larger. Similarly, you can sort, and then you don't need to. Then you need to check. And lastly, if you do SIMD, the vectorized kernels, then these are manually written vectorized kernels, and what you get is sort of close to the theoretical maximum here. So I want to pay your attention to the AVX512F, and the theoretical maximum is like 4 times, and instead we get 2.5 to 3.8, which is good enough, right? So it's fast, and people know it's fast. And one of the ways we can see that is this paper was published in 2020, and in this time it's gotten 52 citations. Right? People have adopted this code. As I said, this is what the repository looks like in public. And just to give you a insight into why I wrote it, it's because I had this project that I had to do, and we couldn't run it. Thank you. And then I created this custom code for Expert that I created in 24 hours. And these acknowledged experts got a 6,000 times speed up. So that demonstrated that we needed Corrfunc to be public, and that initial 5-minute calculation that anyone can now do only in 5 seconds. Right? I'm going to skip over this slide. Just know it's highly customizable. And I'm going to go to the last one. It's a very custom. It's a highly optimized software. It's really fast. It's used widely. But the question that I always have is that, is it still sustainable? I don't know yet. Thank you. That's all I have.
Oh, great. Thanks, Manodeep. Please type in your questions in Q&A, so we can ask a few questions. In the meantime, I have maybe a question for Manodeep. Have you considered porting the code to a GPU, and if so, what kind of performance would you expect on a graphical processing unit compared to the CPU, for instance?
Yes, so we have had, this is one of the parts of the sustainability, because I don't know GPUs. So we have some implementations, GPU implementations, thanks to ADAX, but it hasn't been. It's shown speed up on GPUs, but it still needs to be added in. So yes, we are working on that.
Excellent. Time for questions for Manodeep. I guess the that problem of sort of finding the box in which contains some points seems to be a fairly general problem and arises in other areas as well. Interpolation and all kinds of algorithms actually use that. A question is coming up. What do you mean by sustainable?
Yes, it's a good question. Because sustainability means different things. What I really mean is that if I have never been paid to develop or maintain Corrfunc. So what I really mean is that would Corrfunc exist if I were to stop ownership of the project? Would Corrfunc still be functional? Would it continue to serve the astronomy community, right? Also, like as new hardware arrives, writing a new, like ARM64, the Mac M1s, it takes significant effort to do so, but then how do we maintain it? So there are lots of questions around long-term longevity and how that project will survive as a utility for the community. That's what I mean.
Excellent. Any other question? Well, thanks again, Manodeep, and good luck with Corrfunc. And I think it's really great to see these efforts being shared and made open source so that other people can take advantage of that.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I think the next presentation will be about Dask. It's going to be given by Wolfgang Hayek and Maxime. The title is How to Draw an Owl, Transitioning from Tutorials to the Real World with Dask.
Hello, everyone, and thanks a lot for coming along for this presentation. And thanks for the introduction, Alex. So yeah, I'm Wolfgang Hayek. I'm an HPC research software engineer, actually a colleague of Alex at NEVA in Wellington. And I'm co-presenting this presentation with Maxime. Maxime, would you like to quickly introduce yourself?
Thank you, Wolfgang. Tenakoto katoa. My name is Maxime Rio. I'm working as a data scientist at NEWA as a data science engineer at NZRSE, helping scientists to deploy and optimize their machine learning code on the HPC. This being said, Wolfgang, I'll let you introduce the first part of the talk.
All right, thanks, Maxime. Okay, so yeah, this talk is going to be once again about Dask. For those of you who have attended last year's NZRSE conference, you might remember that both Maxime and I had talked about Dask already, and we like Dask so much that we thought, okay, we'll just treat you to another round of Dask presentation. So this is once again work that we've done together with researchers, so Glenn Reeve, Yalu Wen, and Wendy Lee. And to explain the title a little bit more, you're probably all familiar with the famous internet meme, How to Draw an Owl. So you first start with the circles, so that's the baby steps, and then once you've done that, then you start drawing the rest of the owl. And we felt that, so working with Dask, that it's always a bit like that when you start with a tutorial. So the tutorial looks great. So you go through it and you think like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. It's super easy. Okay, very powerful tool and so forth, and everything works just fine. And then you get confronted with reality. And so you go to your project and you realize, oh, okay, so it's not quite that simple. I need to change this. I need to change that. And suddenly you realize, okay, maybe it's not all that simple after all. And so, so we thought we'll share a bit of our experience with you that we've gathered with two different projects. So the tidal analysis project, I will present that, and then I'll hand over to Maxime to talk about the lasso regression. And before that, I will quickly introduce Dask for those of you that are not familiar with this tool yet. So Dask is written in Python, and it is a parallelization tool. So it is advertised for analytics. So when you look at the webpage dask.org, it says so, but of course you can use it for any kind of workload. Ideally written in Python, that's the easiest, but of course you can also call other things from Python. So you can always use Dask as a parallelization engine. But I guess in terms of functionality and integration and so forth, it's probably best suited for any Python work. The kind of parallelization that you get is work sharing. So you can fire up any number of works workers. You give them a function or more or several functions, and they will be working through these functions for you. So I wouldn't recommend using Dask for anything like climate simulations or things like that. So it's not a replacement for MPI. It has too high latency for these kind of things, and it's also probably not really the right kind of parallelization and that you get, but although it's arguable, I guess. But it is really great for any kind of data processing or any general work sharing type parallelization. One particularly nice thing about Dask is that it's really flexible. So it separates front end and back end. So by front end, I'll talk a bit more about that in a second, but by front end, I mean the API that you use to interact with Dask. And then the back end is whatever executes your parallel workload. And so this allows it to be super flexible, and you can easily go from a laptop where you start developing your code. You go to a workstation, to the HPC, to the cloud, and each of these can be used with different types of backends, whatever makes the most sense in your particular situation. And also, as a last comment on that, on Dask in general, the documentation is actually great. So the title of this talk should hopefully not mislead you. It is really, really well documented, but Dask is complex, so it's not something that you can just pick up in an afternoon if you want to look a bit more into the details of how it works. And then there's never enough documentation, and even if there was, you probably don't have the time. So just a few more words about the front ends and back ends. So Maxime will talk a bit more about the APIs. I won't spend too much time on that, but Dask has different ways that it gives you to interact with it between high level and low level. So you can, if you're really lazy like me, then you can use tools like Xarray or scikit-learn, and you don't actually have to talk to Dask at all. It's all done under the hood. Or you can use one of the high-level interfaces with Dask that it offers itself, or you can go low-level, and then you have complete control. Whatever you do, in the background, Dask always creates a task graph. It's very similar to what the different workflow schedulers do. We heard about that earlier today already. So tools like SnakeMake or Silk, they all use task graphs to define the dependencies, or to work through the dependencies between the different bits and pieces, the tasks that need to be done. And on the right-hand side, you see the schedulers. So these are the backends that execute your job. And so there's a few listed, but there's not an exhaustive list, so there are many more. Also one more word on swapping backends. Yes, it is possible, but there are some differences between the backends, so they're not all equal, and you may have to change your code a little bit. But it depends on what you do and then how you do it. So so for certain applications, you can easily swap the backends without too much hassle. Okay, so I'll now talk a bit about this project that we did. So the science part of that is concerned with tidal analysis. So that means that the researcher had some output from a finite element simulation of the shallow water equations for simulating sea tides. And that was spatially resolved with about 1.8 million locations. And the simulation then produced a time series. So you end up with 1.8 million independent time series of water levels at each of these locations. And these time series are then analyzed using a tool called Utide, which is written in Python, and which takes about, after some optimization, which takes about 3 to 4 seconds to complete one harmonic fit of the water heights. And then multiplying that up by 1.8 million, you end up with a total job duration of 75 days, which is obviously not very practical. And so after some discussion, we decided to go with Dask because the Utide package is already written in Python, and because of Dask's flexibility and ease of use. And so we went along with that. And after some more discussion, we realized that it would be very beneficial to convert the output data from the simulation into NetCDF because Xarray works really nicely with Dask. And Xarray, if you haven't heard about that yet, is a package that makes handling NetCDF files super easy. So if you haven't tried it, have a look at it. It's really great. So what it does is, and I'll show you some code in a second, what it does is that it loads the, so X-Array, it loads a netcdf file for you, and it's very easy to get Dask to work on the netcdf data in parallel. So it does it in a work sharing fashion, so you can slice up your array into bits that are then processed by the different workers, and you can also do this out of core, which was useful for this case because we had hundreds of gigabytes of data. If you know how it works, then it's super easy to use. So it's very concise. It's only a few lines of code, but it does, in some cases, it can take a while to know how to use the API properly. And if you want, you can also get hold of the Dask objects underneath and do something really custom if you need to. Another great thing is that the Dask integration allows you to read and write netcdf files in parallel, so which is extremely useful. Okay, now it's time for some code. So, of course, I stripped out all the administration code and so forth, and the actual worker function, which is highlighted in blue here, so that performs the harmonic fit. So this is just the bare bones parts that you need to load the file and process in parallel. And so in the first line, I instruct X-Array to load the netcdf file, and I ask it to give each worker the full time access because of the harmonic fit, but to also slice up the spatial dimension so that each worker gets a batch of spatial nodes. Then in the second line, I ask X-Array to apply my worker function. I declare the data that I wanted to transmit to the worker function, and I have to declare core dimensions. So core dimensions are dimensions that are not split. And the time axis in this case is not split. Also, the harmonic fit gives me back parameters. So it's I get a different type of data structure out than I put in, and so I have to declare that as well. So that's why I declare a core dimension parameter, because again, it's not split. That's for each individual node. Then in line 3, I create a new X-Array dataset based on the output from my worker function. And in the end, in line 4, I ask X-Array to write out the netcdf file. And this is something I haven't mentioned yet. It's only when you come to such an endpoint of your workflow that the Dask will spring into action, because it uses lazy evaluation. So once it executes that line, then everything will launch and start the computation, but not before. So Dask also has a very nice feature. It has a dashboard that you can use to check in what it's doing, and part of the dashboard is a task display, and this is just for illustration. So these are all the different tasks that are run and executed by Dask that were automatically generated by X-Array and Dask. So this is just for illustration. So you see the different steps for opening the data set and for processing the data and so forth. So one thing I learned the hard way was, and so thinking again of the topic of this talk of going from tutorials to the real world, you have to be quite careful with the chunk size. So my situation, of course, was a bit particular here because I have a very long spatial access with 1.8 million, and if I use a very short or a very small batch size of say just 10 spatial nodes, and I end up with a huge amount of individual tasks. And the next problem is that Dask, when you run it on a distributed system, will need to use the network to communicate all this information about how the tasks are defined and so forth. It will have to communicate that to the network. And so if you multiply the messages by the amount of tasks, you end up with huge message sizes. And so in the end, I ran into the problem that Dask suddenly asked me for more than 60 gigabyte of memory. And after looking at the instructions, I realized, okay, deep down in the X-Array instructions, there was a warning about this, but of course, you don't necessarily read all of that. And so, yeah, and now I know. And then you also have to be a little bit careful about how you split your dimensions to make sure the data ends up in the right place. And X-Array will also will also transpose the arrays so that these core dimensions, or the dimensions that are not split between the workers, are always last. That's also something to realize. Otherwise, you might end up with surprises that your data suddenly looks a bit different. And the last slide for me. So Dask has one drawback in that debugging is pretty tricky. So it's in parts because of the lazy evaluation. So I tried using a Python debugger with it, but you just end up going from one object level to the next. So you don't really get anywhere with it. And so I had to use printout debugging. Then you have parallelization and all of these things. So it can be a bit cumbersome to parallelize it. There's a few things you can do. You can run in serial, for example, to make life a bit easier. But that is certainly something that you might have to struggle with a little bit. And another recommendation I have is it's always a good idea to store results if you can. So of course, it depends a bit on the situation, but it can happen that in a very long processing pipeline that after hours, the whole thing breaks down because there was an error, and then you might lose all your results. So it's a good idea to store as much as you can. And also lastly, the worker function can be programmed in a way that you can catch exceptions as they happen and then do something useful with them, so that otherwise Dask by default will stop running. So what I did in this case was I caught the exception and invalidated the data to make sure that it's clear that something went wrong, and print out a warning message. Okay, and that's all from me. And with that, I'll hand over to Maxime.
I'm here, Wolfgang. So in this second part, I will talk about consultancy projects done at NZRSE in collaboration with two scientists from the University of Auckland, Yalu Wen and Wendy Lee. Next slide, please. Okay, so this consultancy consists in scaling up an algorithm, the block HC lasso regression. We want to re-implement it to scale to a very large data set. To give a bit more background, actually, we want to apply this model to part of the UK Biobank dataset, which is a genomic dataset. The input data will be a 2D matrix, which consists in roughly, just to give you an order of magnitude, 1 million feature by 1 million observations. And hopefully it's a sparse input data made of integers. So if you compress it, you obtain about 100 to 150 gigabytes of data on disk. But the trick here is the block HC lasso algorithm does first a transform of the data. So for each of the input feature vector, you will increase their size. So you transform them and they will become 60 times bigger. And that's where we start having problems, because if you pre-process all this data, you end up having something which is in the order of 200 terabytes of data. So if we could avoid to have to store this on disk, that would be great. And actually, regarding related to this, there's a second trick, which is we don't need all of the features vectors. We only need a subset of them to be computed as part of the lasso regression part. And to select which of the features we want, we use what's called the sequential strong rule. There's an algorithm which I will explain in a second, but that will let us just select which one are relevant or not for the problem. So here's how this algorithm works. We take the transform feature vector, so this large one. We compute a dot project with a vector of residual that we have. It gives us one number per transform feature vector, and if this number is beyond some threshold, okay, we keep it and we run the lasso regression with it. And so this is where Dask will come handy, is because we can use it for two things. First, we can use it to compute on the fly this transformed feature vector, so we don't need to store them on disk. And for each of them, we can compute this dot project in parallel. And of course, Dask will be used to distribute this task on a very large scale backend, which is the HPC, running the workers in Slurm jobs. And when you see on the right is actually the Dask graph corresponding to this task, to this computation, and each of the circle is this transformation and dot project. You can see they have no relationship. There's no arrows between them, so it's a really embarrassingly parallel task. Next slide, please. Okay, but how do we implement this coding from the coding side? Well, that's where actually Dask gives you a lot of options, a lot of flexibility, and there are different APIs. And here I'll just highlight 3 ways to do part of this job, and each of them has some benefits. And the key message here is it's nice to use the API that lets you formulate the best your problem to be solved. So the first API I want to mention is called the Dask Array API. And this one makes you manipulate objects which are very similar to NumPy multidimensional arrays. And so you can just manipulate these fake multidimensional arrays, combine them. That does not trigger any computation. But at the end, when you get your Dask array, which should hold the results, you can press the compute button, and then it will trigger all the computation on the Dask backend for you. And if you are using Jupyter notebooks, what you can see on the right is a graphical depiction of a Dask array. So you can have a bit of information about how things are split in it. That's practical. Okay, the second API I'd like to mention is called the Dask Bag API. So this one is more if you want to manipulate things using list or any type of sequence. So similarly to the previous API, what you will end up manipulating are not actual lists containing results, but are lazy lists. So they pretend to be collection, but actually they're just holding what are the tasks to be done to obtain results. And if I detail a bit more this snippet on screen, so on line 1, I'm just creating this fake list made of indices from 0 to the number of features. And then I call the map method on it, which let me apply a function on each of the elements to load each of the feature. And again, the all features variable I have here is not a real list. It's just this fake, it's holding the computation that needs to be run to obtain the results. And the last line is again a map application, and this time I'm projecting and computing the dot product. Okay, and the last API I want to mention is a bit more lower level. In Dask, when you have a scheduler that actually is responsible to sorting the tasks to different workers, you access it via what's called a client. So the client is actually responsible for taking a function, which is what you want to compute, a Python function, and you give it to the client, and it will pass it to the scheduler that will do its job afterwards. And what you see on this line is actually I'm using the map function of the client to use one function, but which will be applied on every element of a collection, which again here is just a set of indices. What is interesting in that case is what is returned is a list of features, which open the box for a lot of weird pun like I will cancel the future or these sort of things. But more importantly here is the future objects hold the promise of a result, and at some point you can look at it. Is it available? Is it not available? So it gives you a bit more control about how you retrieve your results. And again, there's no best API. There are bridges, so you can convert from one API to the other API. In my particular case, I used the last one because I needed some special tricks that only this one could give me. Next slide, please. Okay, so here I will repeat a message that Wolfgang already said previously, because and that's probably one of the top one message to learn about is be careful with the chunk size of your task. So similarly to what have been presented with Xarray, actually, for the different APIs, you can specify a chunk size, which means how many elements you will pass to an individual task. So you could have one task per element. In my case, I have these feature vectors. I could have one task for feature vectors. But in the end, the end application has 1 million of features, which means 1 million of tasks. And that's a huge overhead for the scheduler, and that causes a lot of problems. So if you use this method, so for Dask array will be the map blocks, for Dask back the map partition, and for the client map you need to do a bit of you need a third-party package called tools to actually pre-chunk the sequence for you. But if you use this, actually you can make your function, which is executing the task, run on a subset of elements, and so you end up having less tasks. Of course, it's a trade-off between if you have too few tasks compared to the amount of workers, you can end up having starving workers, so they're just spinning and waiting for a job to do, but actually there's nothing to give them, while the other workers are still running their long-running task that they could have shared this load with the other workers. So there's a bit of experimentation to be done here to find the right balance. Next slide, please. Okay, the last point I like to talk about is the cost of data transfer. So sometimes it's very obvious when you use Dask what's the type of data you're moving around between the main code and to the workers and back and forth. But sometimes it's a bit less clear. So I think it's always good to keep an eye on the dashboard, on the Dask dashboard, and especially what I'm showing here is a view of what's called the task stream. So in this graph, what you see on X is the time. What you see on the Y-axis are the different workers. And every time you see a green box, it means that the workers are doing number crunching. They're actually doing work. The thing which is annoying is when you see red, actually, it means they're waiting for stuff to be transferred back or forth. So that's IOs, and you want to minimize this. And in this specific application, actually, I realized at some point I was loading an HDF5 file in the main code, and then it was supposed to be loading the chunks from the workers, and I think it's doing that. But there are some things which are moved around which I did not want, and they appeared there, so I needed to adapt a bit the code to reduce the amount of IOs. So something which is quite important to keep in mind. Next slide, please. So this being said, I'll reach the summary and wrap up a bit this presentation. Next slide, please. So in a summary, Wolfgang and I, we really love Dask, and we feel like it's a very good tool when you don't want to do a data analysis at scale. And obviously, it's well adapted for Python. It's meant to be used from Python. And there are two key elements that make it great is this variety of APIs. So again, you have seen the very high level X-array. You can also use it, for example, as a backend for scikit-learn. But you have also this lower API like the Dask arrays and the Dask bag and even the future API. And again, the key message is they're all great, and you need to find the one which fits, which lets you express the best your problem. Okay, and the second very good element is this variety of backends that lets you actually switch between a workstation to an HPC or a cloud. So they are not exactly working the same, but most of the time you can transparently switch between them. But you need to be aware that they have some specificities, so you can encounter some glitch at that stage. And finally, so that has a lot of moving parts. So it's inherently a complex tool, but we really feel like it's worth taking the time to learn it. And again, the documentation is great. The best practices page is wonderful. So it's nice to have a look. And of course, if you want to talk more about this with us, about that, we're always happy to receive message and answer them in that space. And that's it.
Hey, thanks both of you, Wolfgang and Maxime. Just a question came in from Johnny Williams. He's asking, could I use Dask to speed up a Python script, for instance, by making it run on multiple processors? And I guess maybe a follow-up of that question is, can you actually also run across nodes, or are you confined to run within a node of the HPC, for instance, Maui?
Do you want to take it, Maxime, or shall I?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, all right. So I'll make a start. So the answer is a yes with double exclamation marks. So definitely. So I'm pretty sure that as long as the type of parallelization they need fits what Dask can do in terms of this kind of work share parallelism, then definitely it should be pretty straightforward. So with a few pitfalls, as Maxime and I pointed out, to parallelize it with Dask. And you can very easily run on an HPC. So there's different ways of doing that. So what I used is Dask MPI. Where Dask sits on top of MPI. MPI is a message passing interface, so some of you might have heard of that already. This is what is used for these really big simulations like astrophysics or weather forecasting, climate simulations, and so forth. And Dask works very well with it. It's very reliable, and you can put it on an HPC. And if you run on a machine like Mahuika that's very busy, the good thing is that you can put your workers into all the different free spots that are on the machine, so you get very good throughput because you fill in the gaps basically with it, and especially if your workers don't need to communicate much, you get extremely good throughput, and also NZRSE is happy because then you basically utilize the machine to the max. And there's also Dask job queue, but Maxime knows it much better than I. So maybe Maxime, do you want to talk about that or?
Yes. So the Dask job queue is a sort of an umbrella project that provides multiple classes of backends that can run on HPC. So for example, you have one for Slum clusters, and what will happen is your worker will be running as Slum jobs. The interesting thing of that one is you can have one the main code can live in a long-running job and periodically actually have a burst of activity that will spawn sort of children jobs that will host your workers for some part of your workload, and then you can just shut them down and requeue new ones later if you need. So you don't need to schedule all the jobs that we need to host your workers beforehand. You can just spawn them dynamically during the main task. So I found this quite practical.
That's great. Yeah, please. I think there's a little bit more time for more questions. Otherwise, I mean, I have a question for Wolfgang. I think there was a slide where you showed, you know, a little bit of the code that you wrote for the title modeling part, and and I remember that you had an array that said out results, and you had to cast that into a XR data set, and I was a bit surprised about that. I was hoping that the output of, was it the map function? I can't remember exactly, but I was hoping that the output would already give you an XRA data set.
I can bring up the slide. I'm not sure if it's possible to bring the slides back onto the screen. Okay, thanks. So yeah, so you're talking about line number 3?
Correct, yes.
Okay, yes, so that's just because of the XArray object structure, because writing to a netcdf file is only possible via a method. So you can't talk to netcdf directly through XArray, so you have to create an XArray dataset first, and that will give you the ability to write that dataset out into a netcdf file. The objects that are handled here by the second line, apply ufunc, are just wrapped NumPy objects. And of course you can get the NumPy data out as well. So if you want to do something, your own things with it. So if you want to use NumPy directly on that, on these results, for example, or do something else, write it into a CSV file, for example, then you can get hold of the NumPy object and turn it into a CSV file. But the data set is really just XArray, so it's the XArray way of handling it.
I guess I have another question. That's for Maxime. I think you showed the dashboard. We saw these green areas, which you commented as being areas where, you know, representing tasks where the workers were actually doing some calculations. There were the red areas as well, where they were waiting for the tasks or for other tasks to complete. And what about the white areas?
Oh, the white areas are when the computation is not in Dask. So basically, it's something else which is happening in the main code. I mean, if you see only white, you know, and there's nothing, it means that it's not doing any computation on the Dask workers. And of course, you could have one task which is spending a bit more time, and all the other ones are finished. So the white part will be your main code waiting for this last one to be completed.
Excellent. One more question came in from Mike Laverick. He asks, do you have any experience using Dask with any of the HoloView's suite of tools, bokeh, data shader, etc.? And if so, how did you find the learning process?
I can answer that one, but actually it was a long time ago. Long time ago means I think more than 2 years ago. I tried a bit of this to explore large brain images, and it was quite nice. As far as I remember, I was using a bit of hvplot, which is an additional layer that abstracts away a lot of the details of bokeh and HoloViews. But now these toolboxes evolve quite quickly, so I don't think that poor memory is very useful for you nowadays, because these packages have improved a lot, I think, over the last few years. But it's definitely on my radar to be tested and to report. Maybe next year I can tell you more about this.
And with that, then let's thank our speakers. I'm just going to clap my hands on my side. I think we have a 10-minute break, and I invite, of course, people to ask more questions and interact with Maxime, Wolfgang, or Manodeep during any of the meetup sessions. Thank you.